Chris Cooperstein, member of the Tolkien Society. I lived in Spokane for what, 2010, 2011, and moved down to the Tri-Cities about 3 years ago. So sometimes I'm up there, but not this weekend. Sorry.
Thank you, gentlemen. Pleasure to be joining you. Nice. We always love alliteration. We always love an extra P in there is always good. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, again, thanks for the warm welcome, Brian Hawk and everyone. Sean Marchese, as Brian said, half of the Prancing Pony podcast, which is a weekly podcast discussing Tolkien, all things Middle Earth and Lord of the Rings. We're actually doing a read through. We take a few pages a few pages at a time and read through each chapter in each episode. Currently tracking about 6 pages per episode per about 90-minute episode, and we're currently close to wrapping up book 3 of the Lord of the Rings, which is not Return of the King. It's actually the first half of Two Towers, and we're on I don't know, maybe a 8 to 9 plus year journey through Tolkien's writings. We started with the Silmarillion, then went into the Hobbit, and we've been in the Lord of the Rings for 3 years. So and many more to come, which I'll be happy to plug the podcast as much as these guys will let me later on in the in the event. But every week we're out with a new episode. So. Yep. They found the hobbits there, strangely enough. One of them was breathing smoke. Yeah. Um, and and actually we've got about 3 more episodes left in this season, after which point we'll take a little bit of a break and we'll come back right around Hobbit Day with our next season in book 4. So yeah. That's correct. Yeah, both. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Both Alan and I have been Tolkien Society members for many years now, and the Tolkien Society has been just tremendously supportive of us. We went to Tolkien 2019 back in 2019, obviously, and that was a big conference in Birmingham. Celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Tolkien Society. So yeah, Alan and I have been just really avid supporters of the Tolkien Society, and it was great to feel some of that love in return. So thanks to everyone who voted for that. That was a pretty special event for us. And And I can hear you guys just fine, but I also got a text from a friend listening to this right now who said that she couldn't hear you.
Okay, now there we go. I don't know why. It looks like Windows changed to a device that was no longer connected.
Okay, so
Randomly.
Are we okay now?
We're okay now. They'll hear it now. So sorry about that. Thank you.
I got a text that says yay, so I think it's working.
Yeah. All right. Sorry about that. I don't know how much they didn't hear. Anyway,
Well,
we're trying to get a larger facility. It's going to be a museum and a historical museum of the entire history of role-playing games, tabletop, live-action, electronic, and hybrids, and a community center. It will be near a bus route. It'll be wheelchair accessible. We're huge accessibility advocates. So by the end of the year, we will have that facility one way or another.
Wonderful.
What that means for Tolkien Moot, because I've been doing it at my house for a while to save money. We used to do it at hotels and stuff, but it was getting really expensive. I had one Tolkien Moot that was $10,000. And we don't charge for Tolkien Moot. So that was all out of my own pocket. And I couldn't sustain it. So that's why we've been doing smaller mini moots from my house. But once we have a dedicated facility, RPG Research will let us use it. We will be able to do a lot more simultaneous games. We'll have, our regular volunteer staff there. It'll be more accessible, more people come to it. Now, we want Tolkien Moot to stay small. I don't ever want to see it larger than 100 participants. There's a magic that happens when you keep it down to that size that makes it a really special experience, and everybody gets to know each other and really share the experience better. When it starts to get larger than that, you have to start, one thing is, the moment we charge for it, we have to pay licensing, and it's insanely expensive for the licensing. So keeping it a free event, keeps us under the radar, if you will. And, so everything's like potluck, and it's all volunteer based, and it still keeps it a community thing. And people have really loved that, instead of going to these big, huge, giant conventions.
And it's also something that people from far away can learn about that online.
Yeah. And we've had people join from around the world at past moots when we used to do it at other facilities.
And be able to see the catalog of what's in the museum. So if you've just tuned in, you're listening to the Tolkien Society here in Spokane, Washington. And we have Sean Marchese from the Prancing Pony podcast joining us. And Hawk Robinson, our founder here, is talking about the wonderful new project trying to get up and running
the RPG Museum.
RPG Museum.
Yep. And I'm going to now share a 3-minute, this is just under 3 minutes, explainer video that we just spent the last few months going back and forth putting together that kind of just summarizes all of this nicely. So give me a moment here. I will try to share it in Jitsi so that you can follow along as well. So let me get the URL. Let's see, copy URL. That way you'll be able to follow along. We'll just do it here in this room because Jitsi, we can share a YouTube video. And then that will be simultaneously streamed if all goes well. There we go.
Did you know research and evidence in practice shows that cooperative music and role-playing games, RPGs, are proven to make lives better? And at RPG Research, we are helping people of all ages, from 2 years old through to senior adults, achieve better function and improve their quality of life through these fun, cooperative, social activities. We provide these cooperative music and role-playing games community programs and research worldwide to make lives better. RPG Research is a 501c3, 100% volunteer-run non-profit, and we have been studying the effects of role-playing games longer than anyone else. Our founder has been involved with RPGs since 1977, researching their effects since 1983, using them in educational settings since 1985, and for healthcare and therapeutic programs since 2004. We cannot do it all alone, and that's where you come in. At RPG Research, we share all of our research as the world's largest open and free online repository on these topics. Now we are building a museum where you can experience hands-on learning, both online and in person. In 2004, there were only around 50 research studies on the effects of role-playing games. Thanks in large part to RPG Research, there are now more than 10,000 content items, including research papers, books, essays, presentations, audio, expert discussion panels, videos, and much more. RPG Research also has the world's only fleet of wheelchair-accessible mobile RPG facilities, known as the RPG Mobile. We also have the world's most comprehensive programs training people around the world on using role-playing games to achieve measurable results, including community programs, school teachers, entertainers, professional game masters, recreational therapists, and many others. All this takes up lots of space. That is why we need your donations for the warehouse-sized facilities to provide all these programs. In 2020, using less than $10,000 US in donations, we directly helped improve the lives of more than 30,000 people around the world. This means that for every dollar donated, you improve the lives of at least 3 people through our programs. With your help through donations, we'll be helping even more people in 2021 and beyond. Do not hesitate to visit www.rpgresearch.com today to learn more about how to donate.
All right, so there's that little blurb about that. Thank you. So I think that summarizes it pretty well. And one part that you might not have heard because of the microphone incident, there's also a for-profit company. I'm founder of both, RPG Therapeutics and RPG LLC, so that if it's beyond what the volunteers can do in the research and community programs, if it's therapeutic, educational, professional training, etc., that's where it goes to RPG Therapeutics and RPG LLC. We actually published our first training workbook at the end of last year. We've got level 1 professional game master training. We're now working on the level 2 training. Just really trying to, it is a profession now, and we're trying to really codify that and improve it and raise the bar and set high standards.
Absolutely.
But what this does for us for Tolkien Moot next year is we will no longer be doing it in the basement of my house. We will be able to once again do it in a facility that allows us to accommodate more people. And so the next Tolkien Moot will be that much better.
Indeed.
Thank you so much, Brian, and everybody else who's kept this kind of going along while I've been kind of, either my health issues or overwhelmed in other ways. So the Moot didn't die.
Well, we all support each other, which is full circle back to Tolkien.
Community.
And absolutely, one of the reasons why, Hawk, you've enjoyed really having your game masters, all the people who are trained to take people through role-playing experiences has been to use sometimes the One Ring because it's so useful as a way of, through the heroic it's starting with that sense of quest, and this brings people together, it sets them in a positive direction, and that could be helpful for therapeutic reasons.
And from the Tolkien fan perspective, we don't want the stories to end. But Tolkien has passed away, none of his sons have continued the stories, etc. The most of the reveals, there'll still be more of the historical stuff that people keep unearthing, etc. But the stories are finished. Mm-hmm. But through role-playing gaming, they don't have to end.
Right.
And really interesting questions come up when you try to do the practical application of gaming in Tolkien's universe. You end up having to ask really practical questions, which makes you then ask really in-depth questions. We've had Michael Martinez on the show many times, who really loves to get into those kind of discussions about that and such.
He's got a great blog.
Yeah, and it just, there's not only that, it helps people who are kind of new to Tolkien really absorb a lot more information. We already know role-playing gaming is a very effective learning modality. It helps you learn the information more effectively than just reading, other ways. And so Other Minds magazine, we're on like the 23rd issue on that. That's both scholarly and gaming related. It's free. Just check it out, otherminds.net. And so anyway, there's a great active community still vibrantly out there, continuing through song and drama and art to build upon the wonderful foundation.
And his crest may have fallen since then, but
we've picked it up.
We've picked it up. That's right.
And thanks to folks like you.
Can I just say hats off to you guys? I mean, Hawk, just hearing you talk about all the work you're doing with RPG therapy and just getting RPG awareness out there. That's really amazing, and I commend you for it. It's actually really inspiring to hear you talk about it. I'm actually just I played D&D when I was much younger, and I've just started to get into it again with my family. My kids are 8 and 6, and we're just starting to play RPGs with them, and they're loving it, and I'm seeing it as the beginning of a long journey for them, and I can already see the positive effects it's having on their lives. So again, hats off to you guys and everything you're doing.
Have you been able to see is it No Thank You Evil? That's a
Have
great.
you checked out the role-playing game No Thank You Evil? It's perfect for ages 5 on up, and it's
Okay.
You can do game sessions in 20 to 45 minutes instead of 3 hours.
And for my 5-year-old who has a very strong imagination,
Yes,
she would be able to use that No Thank
Yes.
You Evil in the story in the game when
And
it's too intense.
once the kids are old enough to read, like we've had 3rd grade reading level be able to GM No Thank You Evil.
Cool.
So it's it's great.
I gotta say, my kids are able to sit through a 3-hour D&D session.
Great.
So
That's great.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is.
But I'll definitely give this one a shot because I know my son's pretty keen on GMing.
Great.
Well-
Yeah, that's a great way to do that, and it's shorter sessions, so it's less overwhelming that first time.
Yeah.
So
Cool.
Speaking of so what is the theme this year?
Right.
And
So-
what has this group here been doing
Right.
related to that? So we get into
That's right.
talking about all this.
So Tolkien Moot has this year been carrying on the second part of a 3-year story arc, which is really following the rise of Numenor in the Second Age.
And why did the Tolkien people pick that? What's going on out in the world that maybe motivated some of that?
After our really easy Fall of Gondolin role-playing campaign
2 years ago.
2 years ago, in which we it was epic, but we were all exhausted. We look back and realized that at the very beginning of MERPCon, the Hawk had created a very exciting and really vivid kind of role-playing campaign, which was Escape from Numenor, of course, about the fall of Numenor, and then subsequently developed
Prequels.
parts, stories that were before that.
Yes.
In time, so that then you had kind of the first contact with human beings back in Middle Earth, who did not have the advancement and the ennoblement of the Numenorians. So, and then of course there's the three different parts here: the rise of Numenor, the golden age of Numenor, and the fall of Numenor. And this is also culturally relevant because right now, of course, a lot of people may be following the fact that Amazon.com, Jeff Bezos basically quit his job as a CEO in order to supervise his studio, because for better or for worse, whatever this is going to be like, it's going to be the most expensive TV show ever created.
Yeah.
And it will be set in the Second Age of Middle Earth.
Which is shocking,
It
right?
really
Because
is.
the licensing is so complicated.
Yes.
Wow.
So we feel kind of it's complex because I would say 2 words that we really would like to use when speaking about what we do here at Tolkien Moot is faithful and creative. Kind of like Hawk was talking about. It's the idea of building on what Tolkien has done, but also being able to go further and add to that story in a consistent way. So we want to be faithful to what's been created, but we also want to add our own. We want to be able to say what if and how. So because of that, it's also interesting to kind of help everybody learn more about the Second Age, because again, if you don't have that background to know, well, what is Numenor and who are these people?
Where did the Dunedain come from? What is that whole history that keeps getting alluded to?
Yes, the backstory in the Lord of the Rings and the movies, which so many people enjoyed.
Yeah.
But
And
the
the fallen giant statues and
Yes.
all these things that
all that really
snapshots.
comes out of this is just an echo of Numenor. You thought
Yep.
this was noble and amazing, but this Elendil and Isildur, these people were really the faithful who were left over, who survived this great civilization. So that's what we want to dig into a little bit, even though we can only just scrape the surface.
There's so much there.
So,
And so this particular group
It certainly seems like the right time to do it, isn't it? I mean, this is really the time for the Second Age. It's about to explode on the pop culture landscape in a big
it
way.
is. That's right.
So I did 3 years of the Numenor cycle back in the early MERPCons.
That's right.
Out of order.
Now we're
Because
doing
the
it in
first
order.
MERPCon was the fall of Numenor.
Yes.
The second Mercon was under Umbar a year after the fall of
Right.
Numenor. And then the third Mercon was a massive effort because we did 5 days, but really 3 days of gaming. It was a 5-day event. Guild companion Joe, oh, I'm sorry, Joe, I'm forgetting your last name right now. He wrote about it as the Mercon Overdose. And he did it all as kind of like the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas experience because it was so intense. And they went through this full arc of First Contacts, which was 5 adventures.
Which
and it
we,
was
by the way,
intense. So you're just doing a small
we're
portion.
squeezing into 3 sessions. So
Yeah, tiny portion of
Yeah.
it. Where first they come as the gift bringers.
Yep.
of
So
Numenor.
what we really tried to get into last year, as we had Sean on last year for Tolkien Moot as part of our panel for discussion. We also had John Garth on there, and Sarah Zama as well, and we even had a professor and teacher here from Spokane as well that was able to join us. And so with all of those people to help, what we did was kind of look at the rise of Numenor and how it began. But this focus this year is definitely on what defined the zenith of Numenor. And part of that includes the fact that the Numenorians were given so much. And to whom much is given, much is required. And so you have the Numenorians really seeking to be benefactors and having pity on those humans back in Middle-earth who were so much under the domination and shadow of Sauron. So, are we good?
Yeah, so that's where we're at now. Is they're coming in.
We can't hear you guys.
Oh no!
I can't hear you guys at all.
Did I just click mute? Oh, I accidentally just clicked mute there. Sorry. Okay.
Okay, so yes,
All
right.
so we are covering the zenith of Numenor this year.
Yeah, the
And-
great kings of men.
Yes.
Right. That's when they talk about
That's
that.
right. That's right. And from the kind of perspective of the humans, the men who are back in Middle Earth, what must they have thought when they saw these great sea kings rise up out of the west?
Who were? So I'm 6'7" now, and that was like average height.
Yeah.
And so.
And you know they look good until they're 300 years old, right?
Right.
You know, like,
Right, yeah.
you
No,
think
yeah.
Aragorn looks good at 87, 88. I mean,
Yeah.
those guys are like pushing
The line-
200, 300.
The
Yeah.
line of Elendil was blessed up to 500 years.
Yeah.
And then the regular Numenorians were blessed to 200 or 300 years. And then it was just like a very sudden, and they went gracefully. They embraced
Yeah.
death. They weren't death worshippers. They embraced it as the gift of
Yep.
Iluvatar.
That's right. And so then they wanted to carry that gift on and pass it forward or pay it forward. And so they did in their first contacts with the humans, the men of Middle Earth. And so focusing kind of on the big idea of if we were to take all these kings, and there's a lot of kings, a lot of people's names in the Silmarillion, but essentially there's 3 different sections of time. There's the very first couple of kings, which really the first king is Elros, who is the brother of Elrond.
Elrond.
So it's really interesting when you think about that too. We meet Elrond in the Lord of the
The
Rings.
split. They made the choice.
That's right,
Half
because
elven.
Both of them are half elven, half man, so they get to choose which destiny will they follow. So Elros chooses
Who
man
down the line is the great whatever of
of Aragorn.
Aragorn.
That's right.
Yeah.
Somebody did the math once. I think it's something like 68 generations or something like that. Right? But yeah, I mean,
Or yeah, like Arwen and Aragorn are cousins.
You're right.
our first cousins, 68 times removed. Yeah.
So we're really covering for those of you who want to follow along or look at this, but we're looking in the middle section, just kind of arbitrarily picking it from Tar Eldarion. As the
Roughly
beginning.
what year time period?
So from about 883 would
Second
be.
age.
Yep. Now I'm gonna cheat a little bit on that and say what we're talking about with that first contact really happens in the 600s and 700s Second Age.
Early on, yeah.
Early on.
They started leaving Numenor for the first time
Right.
after being there. After they
Right.
got the Isle of Gift, they just kind of explored all around there for a long time. It was hundreds of
Yes.
years they were gone.
Right.
And meanwhile, Middle Earth fell into darkness.
Mm-hmm.
Sauron and their beasts and all of that spread, and it became a land of terror.
Yeah.
And nighttime especially was terrifying to those throughout Middle Earth. You had your little bastions of the elves and such, but they kind of huddled into their groups. And it was a dark and scary time back in Middle Earth, while Numenor was this beautiful, glorious, Tolkien wrote it as part of his Atlantis mythology, right? There were early
Right.
drafts of that. And so right now, it's this beautiful utopian environment. And they've explored where they are, they've done enough of the land. They're now going back and exploring the world, going all over the place.
Because they are not allowed to go west to
Right.
Valinor, because there's the Banner of the Valar. And why would that be, Sean? Why are men, as opposed to elves,
Or
not allowed?
mortals, just mortals.
Why are mortals not allowed to go west as the elves may?
Because the west is where the Undying Lands are. The west is where the Valar, which are basically the little g gods of Tolkien's world, that's where they live. And so the elves are allowed to go there. That's basically the story we get in the Silmarillion. But men can't go there. Men, that's not in men's nature to live in the land of the Undying. And there's actually some really interesting stuff in Morgoth's Ring, which is the 10th volume of the History of Middle-earth, about, sort of like the metaphysics of why that is the case and what might happen to a mortal person who set foot on immortal land. But basically, yeah, that's just it. I mean, mortal men are not made for the Undying Lands. They can't go that far west. And so basically what the Valar do is to thank them for the part they played in the First Age in overthrowing Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. Basically what they do is they give them an island that was just on the screen here on that really cool map that you guys had. That's basically halfway between the Undying Lands and Middle-earth, basically as far west as men are going to be allowed to go. There it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's Andor.
And you can get that in Other
it's-
Minds magazine, that version of it.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it's called Andor, the Land of Gift, and it is a gift to men in appreciation for what they did in the First Age. But that's it. That's as far as they can go. It's sort of the furthest extent of their reach. And so when you're looking at Numenor, what you're really looking at is Tolkien's idea of this is the pinnacle of humankind, right? This is the best thing that men can achieve. This kind of existence.
So if you look, we go clear up here. This is the Middle-earth area. This is Amon, the Undying Lands. Tol Eressëa, there's Numenor.
That is one of those maps of Arda that looks curiously like our own world.
Yeah, well, but
Yeah.
but it's based on.
Yeah,
These
no,
are
it
based on-
absolutely is. Yeah,
Yeah,
it
so this
absolutely is
was
meant to be our world. So that's a cool
Arda
speculation of where it
second
might have been.
age
Yeah.
around 2000. This is from Dr. Thomas Morwinski out of Germany. This is one of the early Other
Very
Minds
cool.
magazine episodes. Merpcon 3. He did the changing of the worlds after every catastrophe, how the world was remade each time.
I always
And this
imagined-
fits around that
Yeah,
time.
I always imagined there being more ocean between Numenor and the Undying Lands, though.
Yes, but it really
Yeah.
wasn't that far. He really did a lot of research.
Hundreds of miles, but not
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah, that right there is 250 miles from that spur to Tol Eressëa. But the main thing is the mists, right? This whole area over here made it much more
Silver
challenging.
glass.
Yeah.
Basically, once they got further west, once they got far enough west, so the mariners of Numenor, because they were all mariners, it was a very much a seafaring culture. And basically, once they got so far west that they couldn't see the shores of Numenor anymore, they weren't allowed to go any further. That's what, when you guys were talking about the Ban of the Valar, that's what that means.
And it's,
And it's
described-
basically just to kind of keep their ambitions in check. I think it's to keep them from wanting too much. Go ahead, Hawk. Sorry.
for the distance. Also, it was described that at the top of Meneltarma, which is the mountain in the center, which is where they would go up and thank Iluvatar and all of that, supposedly on a very clear night and such, you could see the lights of Tol Eressëa
The
off in the
keenest eye.
distance. Yeah, the keenest eye could see that. So
Right.
that kind of puts a little
And-
perspective there too.
And remember, this is a flat Earth at this time, so
Right.
so that would have been possible.
Right.
I think that with the Earth's curvature now, I don't think that would be possible even if it were a few
Yeah,
hundred
well,
miles.
and it was removed from access anyway.
So this
it
brings
just-
up a
Right,
really
right.
important point to start us out with, which is that really there was no closer place that the Valar could give as a home
Right.
to these Numenorians. And so it's a tremendous privilege and honor to be given a land this close. But at some point they have to say, your doom, your destiny is not the same, and yours, you do have some kind of afterlife, but that's one it's going to be sundered from that of the elves. And so we
Yeah.
have this rough 1,000 years of golden age, and maybe if we go back before Tar Eldarion, we have this Tar Elendil, if we go back to the very beginning of that mariner kind of like Sean was talking about, the seafaring and navigation, we're talking about like Portugal at the beginning of the age of exploration. It's all over the place, and they've done this, and that 1,000 years really lasts until about Tar Minister, which is about the year 1800 in the Second Age. And so it's inaugurated by the expansion of Numenor's maritime tradition, and it's kind of ended by what becomes really more of a colonial and more imperialism kind of.
They start stripping because they kind of strip the trees from Numenor, and they need more lumber for their ships. They start going up the major rivers and start stripping all of the lumber. Greenwood the Great, once what would later become Mirkwood, used to span across Middle Earth, and they slowly, as they each go river channel, start stripping and shipping all of that lumber back to Numenor.
As so often the case, and that actually happens in the time of Tar Al-Daryon, which is one of the kings that we get a really full story about him in Unfinished Tales.
That's right. But as so often is the case, it's easy to see ahead of time all the little markers and things that say, oh, this is not going to go in a good direction. But we want to go back and ask a few questions. First of all, looking at the Golden Age, because next year we get to unpack the fall and why it came.
Nice.
But let's start with the glory of Numenor. Why is it worthwhile to not skip the Golden Age? I mean, what does Numenor really represent within Arda? What does that exactly show us? To Tolkien, was that symbolic of something?
I think it was. I think the fact that it's called Andor, Land of Gift, I think it's symbolic of the idea that this, again, we talked about this, it is a gift that's given to them by the Valar, but it is the most that they can give. This is the most significant gift that man can be given, is to have a very long life, not immortality, because they can't have immortality, but they can have very long.
The gift of Iluvatar for mankind was
is death, and the Valar cannot take that away, because at the end of the day, they are only there to execute Iluvatar's plan. They're not able to change Iluvatar's design.
And the Numenorians, up till the end, towards the end, understood that and embraced that as the gift it was, until that started to change.
Yeah. And so I think in a way Numenor represents. It is very clearly sort of the pinnacle of mankind's existence, right? I think Hawk talked about it being Tolkien's Atlantis story, which is absolutely correct. And the Atlantis story always is sort of a utopian society at first that kind of falls into darkness. But I think that Numenor represents, for us who are not living in that utopia, I think it represents sort of a pinnacle achievement that we can aspire to. But I think, as always in Tolkien, I think there's a very strong cautionary tale there as well, because it's, here's your gift, here's your land of gift that you've been given for all your good deeds in the first age, but be careful what you do with it. And it's what you do with it that we start to change really in the time of Tar Al-Daryon, going all the way down to Tar Kiryatan, who you guys didn't mention, but was the son of Tar Minastir. And that's basically, as Tolkien said, kind of where all the troubles began.
It's like the beginning of the end.
Yeah, pretty much. It's kind of when they first set foot down that road, right? Tolkien, it's always about a road. And that's when they first set foot on that road that is going to lead them towards their downfall.
And the Anglo-Saxons had this kenning for the ocean, which was the whale road.
The whale road, that's right. Yeah.
So even the sea is a road that they traversed. But on that road always has meaning. Why are they setting forth? What is the purpose? Is it to enjoy the great gift of Arda, which Numenor is only a foretaste of, as they learn more about the world and they navigate it all and make their maps? Is it in order to befriend and bless those who remain behind in Middle-earth? Is it to become, as it were, to try to go beyond the boundaries that they've been given? But I like the idea of the flowering of humanity, because it's this idea that humanity within the Tolkien's Legendarium has this potential, and its potential is not limitless. It's not meant to be infinite. And I think that's totally
we're finite beings, and we have finite potential.
And I think that recognition somehow comes into this. Is a flower is meant to turn into a fruit. That is the purpose of a flower. If it was always a flower or a greater and greater flower, it is losing its purpose to become a fruit.
It's a weed.
Yeah. And well, yeah.
I like that. That's cool.
And then to be able, what does a fruit do? A fruit falls and it reproduces, but it's for others, other hands, other minds, to carry on.
Pick up the seed
to
and
pick up
spread
the
it
seed
elsewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
one of the really interesting.
You know, and that reminds me, Brian, of, I don't have the quote in front of me, but it's that amazing quote from Gandalf in Book 5 of Lord of the Rings about how, oh gosh, you know, good earth to till for future generations, right? It's about creating good earth to till. We can't control, like, I think he's talking about overthrowing Sauron. And somebody says, well, there's going to be somebody else. Like, yeah, of course, there's always going to be somebody else, but all we can do is create the most favorable conditions for future generations. And I think that goes right back to your fruit metaphor.
Wow.
And I think that's really cool. I like that.
It is neat. Chris, did you have any comments you want to share?
Other than pulling a lot of weeds to prepare, and how some, I've got 12 fruit trees, and they all flower in different parts of the season. And depending on whether the bees were there or not, this year we got 0 apricots, but I've had to thin out the fruit on the peach tree so that the limbs don't break. I mean, it's that prolific this year. So,
When
those,
the apple tree split in half, it had so much fruit on it.
That's
yes.
fascinating. Because Chris, what you're saying is that the apricots, they all flowered, right?
Yeah, they
Nothing
did.
came of it. Nothing came
But
of
no
it.
fruit.
No fruit.
That's right.
And I think that's maybe kind of an apt metaphor for kind of the potential of and the glory of Numenor is where they're able to flower and to do great things.
Jeremiah Burns says hello from the UK.
Oh,
We
hello,
always love it when
Jeremiah.
He joins us as well.
Hi, Jeremiah.
He's watching the YouTube stream.
Jeremiah is a good friend.
Oh,
good.
excellent. He's been joining our Tolkien Society meetings on and off for years now. We really appreciate
That's
it.
right. He gave me a very fine book. It was a copy of I think it was on fairy stories, but it was annotated by Verlin Flieger, and that was a really nice gift.
Oh, yeah. That's a really good addition. That's a really cool one. There's a lot of extra stuff in there.
That is. So he says, quote, "Love not too well," end quote. There's maybe an element of this going on as well when the Numenorians didn't want to let go of life and leave behind what they'd built. And that's what becomes more and more the theme.
Yes.
And next year we really get into that with the fall of Numenor.
That's Brian's flower just wanting to get bigger and bigger and bigger, as opposed to making way for something else greater, something, to bear something that will bear fruit.
Which reminds me also of that quote in Minas Tirith about loving the genealogies of their ancestors and the tombs. They built greater and greater tombs, but had fewer and fewer children. So you see this kind of echo later on in Minas Tirith, which you can kind of say, well, that's maybe what really happened. The decline of civilization eventually in Numenor, and that's maybe mentioned as well with Minas Tirith.
Yeah, and we know that Tolkien was at least partly thinking of the ancient Egyptians when it came to Numenor. For me personally, I'm more of a Greek and Roman history buff, and so I see a lot of echoes of the Greeks and Romans. But for Tolkien, he was definitely at least partly thinking of ancient Egypt, and I think that's where the idea of these huge pyramids, these huge tombs, kind of this obsession with death. And I'm sure some Egyptologists out there is, tut-tutting when I say that. There's probably more nuance to it. But
no, did you?
Yeah.
That was great. Tut-tutting.
Yes.
Let's just say I meant to do that. But that perception that there is almost kind of like a culture that was obsessed with death in ancient Egypt, and I think Tolkien was very much kind of channeling that in Numenor.
Chris, you were trying to say something?
The other image I've got is the stealing of the fruit or the spoiling of the fruit, and the loss of potential where something is spoiled and not brought to fruition, So we had been gone camping when all of the birds took all of our cherries, and that is a sad tale.
I have 16 trees, I think, on my little lot here, and there's 2 cherry trees, one sour cherry and one sweet cherry. If you look out the backyard, you'll
Oh,
see
man.
one tree is covered in cherries. That's the sour cherry tree. The sweet cherry tree, I never see those cherries. I have not seen those cherries in years. I know they grow. I see them starting, and the moment they're even close, the squirrels and the birds and everything get them.
Generations of wildlife have been nurtured.
Well nurtured.
Yes,
Yeah, exactly.
But that takes away from the height of potential.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you were talking about how you were worried about the branches breaking. Well, I had 2 types of apple trees here. I had a red type and yellow type. I still have the yellow type. And I'm sorry, I'm not great on the specifics. But the red one year just had it was crazy. There were like apples like every few inches. It just, because I hadn't been staying on top of pruning it and trimming it and doing all that. So it just had an immense number of apples. Well, as it got near time to get them, the tree split in half and it killed the tree.
Ooh.
Destroyed the tree. So I've been trying since then to get the other one trimmed, but the other's sitting so tall, it's getting really hard to trim. So now those upper branches keep breaking because they get too much fruit, and I think you could even look for some parallels there.
I think so.
Stories.
And I'd like to hook into something Sean earlier said about Egypt, mentioned Rome and Greece. So interestingly enough, if you think of Numenor as a country of heroes, which literally they were, because these are the 3 houses of the Edain who were blessed by this island because of helping the Valar in the War of Wrath against Morgoth, who'd be Sauron's predecessor. So you have the word hero, it comes from the Greek, and it is this idea of really a demigod, right? Like think Hercules or Heracles is the Greek one. And I was wondering, Sean, we were talking about this a little bit a couple of days ago, but there's a little bit of word nerdery here because the word for hero in Anglo-Saxon or Old English is Haleth.
Right, which will be familiar to Silmarillion readers, or at least might be, because Tolkien borrowed that word, yeah.
For the second house of the Edain, right?
The Edain.
The Haladin, and Haleth, the warrior queen.
Was it second or third? It was one of the 3 for sure, but yeah.
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 So and they spoke a little bit different language than the other 2 houses, the Hadorians and the Beorians. So they had this kind of other dialect.
They were always kind of a breed apart from the other 2 houses of men. They were always a little bit more insular, a little bit more secretive. But they did intermarry with the other houses of men. And so when you look at the Numenorians, they have lineage from all 3 of the houses of the Edain, including the Haladin. But yeah, you're exactly right, Brian. That word Haleth in Old English means hero. And Tolkien actually references that word. It appears in Beowulf, I'm pretty sure, because Tolkien mentions it in his essay Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics. There's an Old English phrase, Haleth under Heaven, which means heroes under heaven. And so that's the only reason that I know that word means hero in Old English. But yeah, it becomes the name of a hero of Edain in the first age, and that's Haleth, as you said, sort of a warrior queen, warrior chieftainess.
You've got also that interesting connection where in the background of Britain, Tolkien may have been thinking too. You've got Boudicca, who is a warrior queen. She's British in the sense of early Breton, Celtic, and very much a barbarian, right? Air quotes there. But you've also got the other one is the Greek, or I should say the Roman Empire, which comes up against it. So you have 2 different kinds of heroes.
Yeah. Well, the cool thing about Tolkien is that he worked from a lot of different sources. He worked from a lot of medieval sources and ancient sources, but it was never one-to-one. If you study Tolkien at all, you always hear the thing about there's no allegory in Tolkien, right? Tolkien cordially disliked allegory, and what that means is that he disliked one-to-one symbolism. The idea that Numenor represents ancient Egypt, or Numenor represents ancient Greece, and that's it. That's not how Tolkien worked. He threw sources into a blender, and he took out what he wanted. And so Numenor can stand in for ancient Egypt. Numenor can stand in for ancient Greece. And so like what you're talking about, Brian, Britain can be the Britain of Boudicca and sort of the interplay with the Romans there. But it can also be the interplay between the Greeks and the Romans and the Germanics of continental Europe. And so there's just all of these sources go into storytelling. And so when you look at Numenor, yeah, it does represent. It can represent a lot of these things.
That's good. I like that how it's like it's not that it's wrong to have like symbolism meant a lot to him, but he objected to it because it meant only one thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
We've talked about
you can see the Greece and Rome thing. Actually, I just read a really interesting book called Tolkien in the Classical World, which is all about ancient Greek and Roman source use in Tolkien's work. And there's a lot of cool stuff in there. And one of the great takeaways from it is that you can see where the historical interplay between, say, the Roman Empire and the Germanic tribes. You can see echoes of that in Rohan and Gondor. But then you can also see echoes of it here, like we're talking about, between Numenor and the men of Middle Earth at the time. So yeah, I think he just kind of pulled from all these different sources to create something totally new. And I think that's why he tried to avoid the allegorical readings, because it does kind of lock you into that one-to-one. This is what this represents and nothing else.
Yeah, we've covered a number of times about how he preferred applicability over allegory, and that that maps much better when you look at it that perspective. Yes, you can look for things that are really applicable to whatever perspective you're looking at. Now, we like to do every hour a short physical break, just a very short 3 to 5 minute break,
so we'll pause
where everybody just physically gets up, moves. It's a health thing.
We'll pause the
it's
live
our
stream.
Policy. We'll keep the stream going. I'll just mute the audio so everybody sees that we're still there. We'll just be back in just a few minutes, and then you've got your questions here, but I'd also like a chance for everybody here to ask questions to kind of queue up into it. So everybody here think about questions you'd like to ask in a few minutes. You don't have to. It's challenge by choice. But if you have questions you would like to ask, any question, right? You've got the guest speaker here, so it doesn't have to be about Numenor. If you want to ask specific questions to the guest speaker, or it can be, of course, about our topics. So we'll be back in just about 5 minutes.
Sounds good.
The Company They Keep
by Diana Glyer, who's an Inkling scholar. And the Company They Keep is basically the whole book is about the ways that Lewis and Tolkien influenced each other through just sort of like friendship, collaboration, their shared religious beliefs, the religious beliefs they didn't have in common because Tolkien was Catholic, Lewis was Protestant. It's a really, really great book, and I'm thinking of it as you guys are talking. That's all. Just wanted to share that.
That's good.
And we're going back on the air now, so we're back on, and because I thought that was great to share. Do you want to just recap very briefly for the audience that we were muted? Just with that little side topic very quickly? Just very short version.
Yeah, I mean, we're just talking about how Tolkien and his friend C.S. Lewis and the other Inklings, Charles Williams I'm thinking of, but yeah, there were several people who in their writing were an important influence on each other. And I think there's a quote actually that I can't remember whether it was Tolkien or Lewis that said it, but basically the idea was that when a particular friend passed away, then everything that person brought out in others also was gone. And I think that was true. You know, of course, Lewis passed away in 1963 on the same day that JFK and Aldous Huxley died. But Tolkien lived for 10 more years. But it is true that without C.S. Lewis, we may never have had The Lord of the Rings, because he encouraged his friend to go forward with it when Tolkien was at a point where he wasn't as confident. And of course, I think also we can see that Tolkien was a great influence on Lewis in terms of inspiring him, including Numenor, which he kind of...
That's right, yeah. He misspelled it, but he did use it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, because he didn't know how it was spelled. But Sean, if you could just repeat what was the book you mentioned again?
The book is called The Company They Keep. It's by an Inkling scholar named Diana Glyer, whom I'm hoping to get on the show at some point.
Nice.
We need to reach out to her and get her on. She's but the book is all about the different ways that the Inklings, primarily Tolkien and Lewis, but also the others. So you've got Charles Williams in there, Owen Barfield, And there were other Inklings, but those are the ones that are best known for the works they publish. But yeah, it's all about how they influenced each other as writers, as friends, as men of faith, as men of the modern age. And yeah, it's a really, really good book. We've started to use it more in the podcast.
Oh, thanks. And there's actually, I think on your website, you have a list of every book that you guys have mentioned on the podcast, correct?
That is correct. We do have a library. So on our website, if I can go ahead and plug it now, it's theprancingponypodcast.com. That's where you'll find links to all of our episodes. There's 200, well, we've recorded 219, 220 actually. 217 of them have come out now. But yeah, links to all of our episodes, and there is a library with a link to every single book that we've ever mentioned on the show. So please go check that out.
I was sad. So 6 years ago, my family were able to go back and take my kids back to England, where we had lived for 4 years, and we wanted to make sure to go to Oxford and see the black pine that Tolkien loved so much.
I wrote about that. Yeah.
I haven't been there yet. I still haven't been to Oxford.
Yes, and it's a really incredible place. I mean, I think the Bodleian Museum also had a great exhibit on Tolkien as well. But the black pine is no longer there because it was damaged in a storm, and they pruned it, but it didn't kind of look as nice. So they ended up taking the whole tree out. They had cut it originally to a stump, and then they decided that that wouldn't work as well. So they removed it. And when we tried to find it, had so completely erased its memory and its existence. I mean, the grass was just seamless over the spot. The only sign you could tell of where this black pine was that Tolkien loved was that this one massive branch that had fallen on the 18th century wall. It was a walled garden.
Oh wow.
They had to replace the stonework there, and so you could see where it had been,
Right.
but the tree was not there anymore, so that was sad.
Oh wow.
So, questions that any of you want to ask, David? Just I'm gonna pan through.
Say your name and your question.
Do you have one?
I have one. I always
All right.
ask Tolkien fans this question.
So
Maybe
speak up,
we can
Samantha.
talk about this later.
Speak up.
But can you hear me?
Yeah, there you go.
I can hear you just fine. Samantha, was it? Yeah.
Yes. What is it about Tolkien's work for you that you feel so drawn to it? And you may have answered this like in the podcast and very early on. That you started a podcast for it, you studied it for so long. Is there like? Because for me, I know exactly what it is, but I like to hear about it from other people. What is it for you that is like gravitated you towards it, that has made it endure in your life for so long?
That's a really good question. And it is a question that I've answered before on the podcast, but I've been doing the podcast for over 5 years now, and I think the answer changes a little bit every time I think about it. Because one of the most amazing things about, and this is not my answer, but I'm going to start here because anybody who's listened to our podcast knows we digress a lot. But I'll start with the fact that every time I reread Tolkien's work, it changes for me. And obviously the work itself is still the same, but I've changed. And so the book that I'm reading now, it doesn't matter how old, but it's very different from the book I read for the first time 30 years ago when I was 15, and I just gave it away. But as I've changed, I see something new in the book every time I read it. And so it does keep changing for me. But I think fundamentally, what it is that keeps me coming back is the depth of the world building. I've been a fan of mythology for my whole life, and I've dabbled in. I won't say I'm well read on modern fantasy. I've read my fair share, but I've been a mythology fan all my life. And when I read Tolkien's work for the first time, that was the first modern fantasy book that I'd read that felt truly like ancient Greek mythology or Norse mythology. It felt like an entire mythological world was there, and that's because of Tolkien's day job. He was a medievalist. He knew Norse mythology. He knew linguistics, and he was able to create this world that felt that real, that had, in his own words, inner consistency of reality. And I think that's what keeps me coming back to it, because it feels more like a real world mythology than any other fantasy world that I could spend time in. And I love lots of them. I love Star Wars. I love, I love lots of different fantasy worlds and science fiction worlds. I love Babylon 5. But Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth is the only one that feels the way it does for me because of that whole mythological scope that it's got.
I'm John, Vice Founder.
Hi, John. Only occasionally. That's not so bad, right?
When I show up. So anyways, we're talking about the mortals cannot go west.
Mm-hmm.
Are hobbits mortal?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
there's an exception for 2.
There is an exception for 2, possibly 3, if you think Sam made it there in the end. Yep. But Tolkien does say very clearly that hobbits they're a branch of mortal men in some sense. We don't know exactly how it happened, but yeah, they're definitely counted among men. So they are mortal. And the fact that Bilbo and Frodo and eventually Sam, if you believe that version of the story, and I do, the fact that they're able to go to Valinor in the end, it is a testament to the importance of the role that they played in Middle Earth history. However, when we say that there's an exception in the sense that they're actually allowed to go to the Undying Lands, but that they do not become immortal there. They actually do eventually die. Tolkien described it in one of his letters. I'm not going to be able to remember which one, but he described it for Frodo as being kind of an Arthurian period of healing, as Arthur is taken to Avalon at the end of his life. It was sort of a period of healing for Frodo and a period of kind of just recovery from the trauma of going to Mordor and back. But he did eventually die. It wasn't immortality that he was granted.
Wow, interesting. Okay, how about you?
Yes. Hi, my name's Anthony.
Hi, Anthony.
Hi, Sean. You mentioned earlier that you're kind of a Greek and Roman history and mythology buff.
Yeah.
I think Tolkien in one of his letters mentioned that the story of Numenor was kind of his retelling of like the Atlantis myth.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could tell us maybe like what that myth was and how it kind of inspired his retelling of it in the fashion of Numenor, and also like in general, what elements of Greco-Roman mythology and history do you think inspired Tolkien in his creation as well?
I can answer the second part of that question a lot better than I can answer the first part. What I can say about the first part is that the original Greek myth of Atlantis comes to us primarily from Plato. There are, I believe, 2 of Plato's dialogues that Atlantis is mentioned in, and if my old classics advisor is listening, she's going to be disappointed that I don't remember this, but I want to say it's Timaeus and Critias are the 2 dialogues that Atlantis is mentioned in. I don't really know that story well enough to tell you what he borrowed from it and what he didn't, but I can tell you that their work has been done on it. So if you do some Googling of just, sort of Plato's Atlantis, Numenor, do a Google search like that, you'll find lots of stuff. Also, the book I mentioned earlier, Tolkien in the Classical World, actually had some stuff on that in it. So take a look at that if you're interested. But it's all the stuff that you probably are thinking when you think of the Atlantis myth. So the idea that these were the greatest version of mankind that has ever existed. They were technologically advanced. They were a seafaring people. They were given all these gifts by the gods. They had everything going for them. And then eventually they got greedy. They got selfish. They started doing horrible things, and eventually they fell. So it's kind of the main arc of the Numenor story mirrors the main arc of the Atlantis story and kind of the main details. Beyond that, I don't know enough about Plato's version to tell you. In terms of other things that Tolkien borrowed from Greek and Roman mythology, there is a lot. There's more than you think, because we tend to think of Tolkien as primarily inspired by Germanic mythology, Germanic literature and language. And that is true. That was his passion. That was what he did for his day job. He was a medievalist and an Anglo-Saxon scholar. However, before he was a medievalist, when he first entered Oxford as an undergraduate, he was originally studying classics, and he was very fond of Greek philology. So philology, if anybody listens to our podcast probably knows what philology is, but if there's anybody out there who's listening who doesn't know, philology is basically the study of the history of languages and the history of language as sort of a cultural marker. So looking at stories written in different languages, finding connections and extrapolating ideas about cultural transmission and linguistic transmission through that. That was Tolkien's job, and he did that with Anglo-Saxon and Germanic languages and literatures. But before that, he did that with Greek literature. When he was an undergrad, that was what he originally studied. It was, I think, 5 semesters in as an undergrad that he switched over to Germanic because he was just switched over to the English department because he got interested in the Germanic stuff. So he knew a ton about Greek literature, the Greek language. I think he actually preferred Greek to Latin. And you can see it in things like the Valar. That's one of my favorites. If you look at the Valar, they map so well to the Olympian gods, with Manwë having a lot in common with Zeus, to Ulmo having a lot in common with Poseidon. It breaks down quickly because then you can look at Aule and say Aule has something in common with Hades, but he also has something in common with Hephaestus. So again, that's where Tolkien is kind of throwing his sources in a blender instead of doing a one-to-one. But there's a lot of stuff like that in there, especially in the Silmarillion, which is where he was doing all of his mythological writing. Yeah. Yes. All right. Awesome.
Good job. Well done.
I didn't know there was going to be a test today, but I'm glad I at least got that one right. Right. No, you mentioned. Okay. There you go. That's great. And you mentioned Turin, Brian, and you're absolutely right about the Aristotelian theory of tragedy. Another plug for the Prancing Pony podcast website. Several years ago, I actually wrote an essay that's posted on that website about how the story of Turin Turambar maps to all of the criteria of a perfect Greek tragedy that Aristotle lays out. And actually, yeah, go ahead. Right. Right.
The whole, we read the Overdose section. Why bad things are happening?
Right. Yeah. Because you make horrible choices all the time. Yeah. Yeah.
But it's a
yeah. 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 Vainamoinen, yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. But I think maybe both, right? Because you have like clearly the Kalabala's in, who's not, he's kind of one that you don't really love. But then you have Greek tragedy idea where, like with Oedipus or other ones, where you have, if you look at Turin and how he ends up, that kind of stuff, I think very much Greek. So I think, again, Tolkien has used all the sources because he read so much.
All of the above, because Kullervo marries his own sister as well, very much like Turin does.
Knowingly and as opposed to
Turin. that sounds right.
That's the big difference. Turin, the dragon, had wiped it from their memory, so they didn't know.
Yeah.
But Kullervo did so knowingly, forced her. Right? It wasn't. That made it different.
And it's the fact that he doesn't know that makes it tragic, right? And so that's where he's bringing in the Oedipus thing, because of course Oedipus didn't realize that the woman he married was his mother.
And as the dragon's dying, lets him have the memory come back.
Right.
No!
Right. Tolkien himself said, again, this is in one of his letters, and I can't remember which one, but he actually said that his three main mythological sources or inspirations for Turin were Kullervo, Oedipus, and Sigurd. And so, of course, all the Dragon Slayer stuff very much is the story of Sigurd the Volsung.
So I'm going to direct this, if I can, back to the Golden Age of Numenor. There's a lot here that we just can't get into. The meaning of the sea and Tolkien's Legendarium. I think we're going to skip that and go on to maybe if we could just take one of the kings from this time period of the Golden Age. We could talk about King Tar Eldarion and a little bit about his. Wanted to read
let me interject some comments before you switch.
Yeah, that's fine.
Switch that. Okay, so they were talking about the weather and how it's 100 degrees, blah blah blah. We'll skip that, but. This is Jeremiah. Tolkien is the only fantasy fiction I've read that I have had to sometimes remind myself that it's not actual history. Earlier about that.
Yeah.
And then
it feels real. Yeah.
Katie McKenna goes 100%. Katie says, trying to remember if Sean studied the classics because of Tolkien or just happened to share that with Tolkien, a kindred spirit.
It's the latter. I studied classics because I love classics since I was a little kid. I actually was trying to teach myself Greek when I was like 6, not successfully, but yeah, I love classics all my life. I loved classics long before Tolkien, and I think it was the similarity to the classics that drew me to Tolkien the first time.
Okay, just wanted to make sure they got the comments in. I'm sorry, I'm fiddling with the audio. I'm trying to filter to reduce echo and stuff, and sorry if that's sometimes cutting out on this end, but you're coming across fine, Sean.
Okay.
On our end,
you guys sound great to me. So
good. It's the stream that. All right. So now, Brian, please, I just want to be sure they got their comments. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think it'd be worthwhile just because we also are finite and don't have all day to be able to explore this. So if we could maybe just talk a little bit about King Tar Eldarion.
Please, let's. Absolutely, let's.
Please. So, Sean, if you could just maybe get into his life a little bit. There's this wife, Erendis. What's that all about? And then we have this interesting tradition, the Oyo Laire, with the garland. This is a really great story, and it might be something that Amazon shows. We don't. But there's this estrangement. So please go ahead.
So the movie Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 kind of brought back a song from the 70s by a band called Looking Glass, and the song is Brandy, You're a Fine Girl. Anybody know that song? That's right. It's basically about a sailor who's kind of in love with a woman who works at a bar, and it's all about him telling her, like, you're a great girl, Brandy, but I can't marry you because I'm in love with the sea. That's my passion. That's my life, my love, and my lady is the sea. That's basically the story of Tar Eldarion, except instead of being honest with her and telling her he can't marry her, he marries her and strings her along for like 50 years or however long it is, like her entire life. It's a great story. It's a tragic story. It is the most, I think it's the most human story we get. It's definitely the most human story we get in the Second Age. It may be the most human story we get in all of the Middle-earth Legendarium, just because it is about a husband and wife who don't get each other, who they're trying to be together, but they're not really trying that hard, and so it's a very sad story, and it's a very it's just, again, the drama in it is so human. There's not sword fighting, there's not battling evil, there's no dragons, there's no Morgoth, there's no Sauron. It's just a husband and wife. It's just a marriage falling apart.
Opposed to like Beren and Luthien with its external pressures, but internal.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's a medieval romance. That's, the romance is blossoming in the midst of this epic quest to get the Silmaril. Even Tuor and Idril, or Aragorn and Arwen, they're like that too. Eldarion and Erendis, it's just a marriage falling apart. But to answer your questions, Brian, so Tar Eldarion was the 6th king of Numenor. And he was a sailor. He was before he was. I'm sorry, I probably got ahead of myself. Before he became king, his father Tarman Eldur was king, and Eldarion discovered he had a passion for sailing. It was I believe his grandfather on his mother's side was a great Numenorean mariner named Veantor. And he learned about shipbuilding and sailing from Veantor and took after his grandfather, and he spent all of his time out on the sea. And he founded this guild of seafarers, and he spent all his time out on the sea.
I'm a sailor.
And
I sail. Kind of a what about Bob reference?
there you go.
I'm a sailor.
Again, my life, my love, and my lady is the sea.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he sails. His passion is to be out there on the sea, and his father is very different from him. Interesting thing about the name. So people who listen to the Prancing Pony podcast know I love word nerdery is my thing. I love word origins. I love name origins, and I love looking into Tolkien's languages. Aldarian's name means son of the trees. Now I'll come back to that in a minute. His father's name was Tar Meneldor. And these two guys could not be more different. So Meneldor, his name actually means servant of heaven. And he was actually named that because he was very fond of stargazing. He stayed on the island of Numenor his entire life. He loved looking up at the stars. He loved thinking about, astronomy and all that stuff. He loved the land that he lived in. Aldarian, on the other hand, despite the fact that he's called son of the trees, he really didn't want any part of Numenor at all. He wanted to be at sea all the time. He really wanted to be out there exploring. And I don't think it was really about the exploration so much. We're not told that he discovered all these great places and that he loved the adventure of that. He just loved being at sea with his buddies. And I think it was just the sheer sailing itself that he loved. And so that's why his name, Son of the Trees, is so ironic, because the only thing he loved about trees was wood for ships. And the reason he's called Aldarian is because he planted a lot of trees. He sort of pioneered the forestry industry in Numenor and also in the Numenorian colonies in Middle-earth. So he's called Son of the Trees, but he does not appreciate trees. He would not be Fangorn's best friend, let's put it that way. He planted trees so that he could cut them down and have timber to make ships with. And so you see from the very beginning of his life that he and his father just never really saw eye to eye. And this kind of characterizes Aldarian's relationships throughout his life. He never saw eye to eye with his wife. He never saw eye to eye with his daughter. And so it was a very sad story because of all that.
Tying in what you just said about tying earlier about the relationships, and Katie here mentioned saying, hearing you say that makes me think surprisingly of the Ents and Entwives, which we just did a few years ago, a whole Entwives campaign. We answered what happened to the Entwives based on a deeper research, best tidbits we could find.
Or did we?
Or
what did you guys come up with? I'd love to know what you guys came up with.
You'll have to watch the stream. Yeah, in the adventure.
Right. I'll send you a teaser.
All right, cool.
But it is, or did we? ...
It's
gotcha.
pretty
There were a couple of different ways to answer it.
It was pretty in depth. Yeah,
we found everything we could find.
We could, yeah. It was Fourth Age.
Yeah.
Aragorn went back to talk to Merry Pippin, and then they're still alive. They went on a quest, but
that's awesome.
Then
we spent a lot of time with the Ents and Entwives this season because we were in book 3, so we had Merry and Pippin coming to Fangorn.
Didn't Alan say recently in a mail bag from Prancing Pony that said something about there were questions about Entwives again and Ents, and he said, "Boy, I'm tired of being a marriage counselor."
Marriage counselor to the Ents and Entwives,
yeah. These guys.
We spent a lot of time marriage counseling the Ents and Entwives this season, and I got to tell you that the thing that I've walked away with is Treebeard wants to find Fimbrethil, and they want to find the Entwives. Even if they could find them, and I think they're dead, I'm sorry, but even if they did find them, I don't think there's anything in common between those two anymore. I think that marriage is doomed. They've grown apart. I think the Entwives just felt like they weren't, I don't know, they weren't being appreciated. They weren't in relationships that made sense to them. They weren't compatible with the Ents anymore. And I just think they Thelma and Louise out of there, honestly.
Well, and if there's one thing that Tolkien, I think, captures well, it's the longing. There's a longing, there's an ache, and we see that in Treebeard's songs.
Jeremiah says, I'm never going to read the tale of Tar Aldarian the same again. Quote, horrendous. You're a fine girl. ... End quote.
And you can almost insert her name. The sailor said, "Rendy, you're a fine girl."
Katie says, sounds like parody lyrics are waiting to be written.
Yes, somebody will do it.
We'll talk, guys. I've spent some time on this recently.
Nice. Okay.
So that Entwives, my theory is, I think they all skipped over to Narnia.
I like it. I like it.
No wonder.
But what did they make the wardrobe out of? An ent?
Oh.
Perhaps,
That's a grim thought.
but I think they are naiads and dryads instead.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
I like it. That's cool.
yeah.
Okay, so tell us more. So that we have this complicated relationship, loves the sea more than her, but he's also responsible for kind of championing. I mean, there were people who had gone before to Middle Earth, but it's Tar Eldarion who really says, okay, now guys, this is a program. We're not just, like, oh, look, let's map the coast and meet the natives and be friends. It's now there's a relationship forming with Gil-galad, right, where he's hearing about a shadow arising in the east. This is kind of the first that's been heard by the Númenóreans about something, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he's the one who ends up bringing back news to his father while his father is still king, because he has apparently, we don't get a ton of detail on this in the story, but he has apparently learned from Gil-galad that Sauron's shadow is growing in the east. And so, yeah, he comes back to Númenor to give the news to his father and say, hey, we need to go help out Gil-galad. And basically his father says, I can't handle this crisis. I'm abdicating the throne. And that's when he steps down and he lets his son take over, which is ironic because I'm not sure that's what Eldarion wanted. I think Eldarion wanted to be able to continue to sail. And I think that if he wanted to have a part to play in that battle against Sauron, which didn't end up actually happening at this point, it happens a couple of thousand years later, right? But I think that he would have wanted to play a more active role in it rather than be the king during it. But yeah, I mean that's kind of what's going on during this period in Númenórean history.
Do we have another question?
Yeah. Talking just a little bit ago about influences from various forces, and I was wondering about Shakespeare. Ents marching forest trees for Macbeth.
Burnham Wood.
Yep.
There's
There's Éowyn and the no man can kill me thing. Yeah.
Right, the prophecy. But what about Tom Bombadil? Or is there any other influence? What's the influence for Tom Bombadil? Is Shakespeare involved or not? I think of Puck.
Like Robin Goodfellow kind of character?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. I think Tom is just this thing that Tolkien came up with. I think he's just he is the spirit of the English countryside who had no business being in Middle Earth, but Tolkien decided to write him into Middle Earth because he's the author, he can do what he wants. I hadn't thought about a Shakespearean influence for him before, but that's very interesting. It's been a while since I've read A Midsummer Night's Dream.
I think they both maybe can come
Similar sources,
but
Yeah.
different branches.
They're both sort of woodland spirits. I always feel like the fairies in Midsummer Night's Dream are more elvish in a way, and I feel like Tom is very not elvish, despite the fact that he's very associated with nature. He's more earthly than even the elves.
Like what was it? The comparison of a calf running through the beads. He's charging through on the way to help Frodo and such. So it's not that sense of grace, is it?
Right. Yeah. No. He's very earthly. He's utterly terrestrial, and the elves, despite the fact that they do love the woods and we associate them with forests, fundamentally they're the people of the stars. Their eyes are always to heaven more so than to earth. But that's interesting. I'm not going to say that Puck wasn't an influence on Tom Bombadil. I never thought about it before. That's a cool idea.
We mentioned Sauron. I mean, isn't he up to something in the Second Age? Something about the forging of a couple of rings or something?
Is that happening now, or is that happening a little bit later?
Yeah,
It is
so
later, isn't it?
right,
Yeah.
because
He's probably just learning about jewelry making right now, right? He's taking a correspondence course.
Apprenticing.
Oh, I just have one more question about children's stories like Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. Like how Bill gets swept along an adventure of it. Also, is the book of The Wizard of Oz, I think.
I think there are, yeah.
Yeah, they're definitely
I-
monkey trees. Complaining about the apple thing.
I don't know off the top of my head, when did The Wizard of Oz come out originally, the book?
1906 or so. I think.
1906.
Very
So
early at that time.
it would have been early enough to be an influence on Tolkien. It is American, though. Most of his influences were British,
And I feel
although
like
he was fond of like American westerns and things like that. I've never
Sure,
heard
but
of.
a lot of talking trees. I mean, those stories go way back.
I know that book. That's by Doug Anderson, right? I haven't read it, but
Yeah, so we did a whole section about, was asked to, what Tolkien was a forward for George MacDonald's The Golden Key,
right.
which in the past Tolkien had written about, saying he loved it, etc. It was very, so he went back and reread the story to refresh his memory before he wrote the foreword. And then he wrote in the letters that he found he could not stand him in any form after anymore.
Right.
And so he then began to rewrite the Golden Key story in a way that he thought was less annoying.
And that's what became Smith of Wooten Major, I believe.
Wooten Major and all,
Yeah.
exactly. So that
Yeah.
so the Golden Key is in here. So this book lists kind of all these predecessors of Tolkien that might have had some of the influence, some of the things you're asking about. And there are a good 20 different books or so listed in here. So that's
Yeah.
one you might want to check out if you have more questions.
As for Alice in Wonderland, I do know that Tolkien wasn't fond of being compared to Lewis Carroll.
Yeah.
But I think it's also because he thought it was kind of reductive. I mean, they were both Oxford professors, and so I think he was just like, yeah, don't compare me with Carroll. I personally see, I do see echoes of that kind of portal fantasy that you get in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and very much in The Hobbit. I mean, the Hobbit is essentially a portal fantasy, despite the fact that Bilbo lives in Middle Earth. He's not really a part of this world that he's stepping into with the dwarves, and so it's very much like Alice kind of going down the rabbit hole. But for whatever reason, Tolkien wasn't crazy about that comparison.
Jeremiah asked, do you think Gandalf knew him well, speaking of Tom Bombadil, by the end of the book? He mentioned wanting to go have a long chat with him. Anyway, okay.
Probably. I think they knew each other. Yeah, I kind of think they knew each other.
That on the podcast, Sean, where it was that part about Gandalf knew that Treebeard would be nearby, and Treebeard expected him. That he, was kind of not surprised that Gandalf was still alive, as if he knew it. And
yeah,
there is this behind the scenes with Fangorn, with Gandalf, Bombadil. They just know, they sense things in Middle Earth on a different level maybe than everybody else do.
They're also old. They've been around so long. I mean, Gandalf is the newcomer to Middle Earth of those three. And though he is one of the Maiar, so he is older than the world itself, he's actually only been in Middle Earth for a couple thousand years when you see him in Lord of the Rings.
And that brings us to the point that the fact that the Istari, the wizards, they come in the Third Age, and they are meant to be, once Sauron later on in the Second Age does create, the One Ring, all of that happens, and the wizards are in response to kind of regaining the balance, as it were. But there's this. Go ahead. Isn't it also because so each time they got in a fight with Morgoth, Melkor, and the Valar, the world kept getting remade and destroying huge swaths of it. And yet again, with the wrath of the Valar and Ilúvatar with the fall of Númenor, remaking the world once again, isn't it more that they're also meant to be more the proxies rather than intervening directly?
Yeah.
So that they don't risk destroying the planet again.
Otherwise, the Shire is next, guys.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So this is the answer to that. Like, okay, we won't directly involve. We're not going to do that anymore.
Yeah.
We want to quit killing and wiping out Valyria and all these other things.
The last time divine interaction was used to overthrow a Dark Lord, Numenor was overthrown and the world became round. I mean, nobody wants that again. What's it going to become next time? You know? Arda is now tetrahedral. Sorry, folks. I mean, it's
So
it's Discworld now.
So we're in the second age at this point, or the come. Maybe one good last question I really want to make sure we cover here is what occurred in the positive mentoring and teaching of the Sea Kings for the benefit of the primitive middlemen, or I should say these middlemen who had primitive technology. They themselves were men, mortals like anyone else, but their situation had been reduced to a primitive state. So what occurred in that positive mentoring and teaching? What gifts were brought, and then what does that say about Tolkien's thoughts here? How does he treat the exchange of skills, goods from one civilization to another? And one more thing to just add in there, and that is that the Druidine are really fascinating because they are in a quote primitive state, but it is maybe more idealized or more permanent or something that's more of their nature. Whereas you sense that the primitive state of the middleman is really one of impoverishment.
That is really interesting. Where should I start on that one?
Well, let's start with the first part. So what was actually given by the Sea Kings, by the Numenorians? What did they bring? What did they give?
The gift bringers of Numenor. What were the gifts?
So we actually have a pretty pat answer from, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, it's a nice, concise answer from Tolkien in Akalabaith, which is at the end of, or near the end of the Silmarillion. Corn and wine they brought, and I have this in front of me. I don't have it memorized. Corn and wine they brought, and they instructed men in the sowing of seed and the grinding of grain, in the hewing of wood and the shaping of stone, and in the ordering of their life, such as it might be in the lands of swift death and little bliss. So what we're really seeing here is they're bringing technology, they're bringing culture, they're bringing, I'm going to make air quotes when I say this, they're bringing civilization. And I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, of the idea of the Romans bringing civilization to much of Europe. I think that's kind of what we're seeing here, is they're having that kind of effect on people who have lost that culture. What's interesting about that is, as you say, Brian, Middle-earth had that. Middle-earth had that when elves were there. Middle-earth had that when the Edain were there, and it's lost that. And so if you look at, it's kind of a almost cyclical view of history, where you've got, the Roman Empire, and you've got all this civilization, and then you've got the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, at least, and then you've got, what historians sometimes call the Dark Ages. I know that term's not really favored anymore, and I know why. But it's the idea that so much was lost from the classical period, and then was eventually regained with the Age of Reason. I think what Tolkien's saying is, this is what would happen if the Romans could come back and bring some of that stuff back and sort of re-civilize, re-enlighten these people of Middle-earth. So I think we can count on the idea that some good came of it. It does seem to be more technological. We don't really get much about culture, to be honest. I mean, I'm looking at the quote here. We don't really see anything about them learning about Iluvatar and the Valar. So it's not that they didn't bring them religion and convert them. They didn't seem to bring them elven lore. So it doesn't seem to be that kind of culture as much as it seems to be technology and agriculture and things that are kind of necessities for life.
Practical quality of life.
Yeah. Which is interesting, because so much of what the Edain got from the elves, I mean, I'm sure they learned all that stuff too. They must have learned agriculture from the elves too, but so much of what the Edain learned from the elves in the first age is more that other stuff. It's that cultural stuff. They learned about the Valar. They learned why they were interested in, like, what the sun was and why they were following it. They learned all that stuff, all that cultural and, religious kind of stuff, sort of got enlightened by the elves, ennobled is Tolkien's word. but yeah, it seems like what the Numenorians bring back to lesser men in Middle Earth is a little bit more practical. And I wonder if that's just because maybe because the Numenorians aren't elves, and so their role in the grand history of Arda is not to be ennoblers and enlighteners, but is to be I don't know, stewards of the planet. Maybe that's what he's saying.
Besides the wood, all the wood they contain, what do the Numenorians get?
Right. Well, and I think I think it's important to make that distinction.
It's a good question.
We're going to get to that place next year where we're going to be really looking at the collapse of this civilization and how does a civilization collapse? What are the things going on that lead to that? And certainly the relationship changes from one of being helpers to being takers, from being givers to being takers. And I think that's why, you know, it's easy in the day and age that we live in to think, well, they would have been takers anyway. And I don't think so. I think there's this.
I don't think so. I think you're right.
A beautiful moment where you can see at this point how it could be if it didn't go in a different direction. And I think it is sad because in a way, almost Tar, Eldarion, and Arendis, that kind of estrangement. It's also true, I think, not allegorically, but just as a parallel. I feel like see Numenor, just as it's getting to its golden age, is really becoming estranged from its purpose, its calling, what it's meant to be.
Yeah. And I think Tolkien is telling us something about the limits of our own ambition there. Because if Numenor does represent sort of the greatest that we can become, he's trying to remind us that as great as humanity can become, it can change on a dime. You know, it can not instantly, but it can very quickly change from altruistic motives, doing this for the right reasons, giving back, being altruistic, and wanting to leave something behind for the lesser people of Middle Earth. It very quickly changes into, okay, we're bored with this now. We're going to go ahead and set up some colonies. We're going to move towards imperialism.
Jeremiah says it's interesting to juxtapose the advancement, in quotes, brought to Middle Earth by the Numenorians as being, quote unquote, good, with the general feeling of industrialization as being bad. Advancement for advancement's sake equals bad.
That sounds very
That's interesting.
Saruman and you know the idea of
metal and wheels. Yeah. I think that's true, and I think wow, that's a really good point, Jeremiah, because I think Tolkien is showing us how, again, the limits of our ambition, how easy it is to kind of get into wanting to advance for advancement's sake, and how much that can corrupt us as it does with Saruman.
Yes, metal short run was a benefit fight against the dark, but actually sowed the seed for their destruction later with the gears and the wheels.
Depends on what you do with the gifts.
Yeah, it's always, I think, about realizing that these things are servants. These tools are meant to be used for a better purpose. It's beating your swords into plowshares. But they're both metal. They're both metal.
Or technology like with Dune and Frank Herbert. And the jihad, the Valerian jihad. Where, you know, so after they're like, no, we have to shape our minds rather than the technology. So that never happens again. It really wiped us out of existence.
Right. Good cautionary tale.
Until it does happen again several thousand years later. But that's a few books in.
Yes.
Any last thoughts that you had, Sean? We're going to have to wrap this up here.
I mean, not on the material. I think this is again. I think that this period of Numenorian history, I'm glad that we had a chance to focus on it, because it's often overlooked. And I think, you know, when we talk about Numenor, we're so busy thinking about the rise, because it's like, oh, Elros, he's brother of Elrond. We're interested in him, and then we're interested in the fall because, you know, you've got Akalabeth, and there's a great story there, and there's Elendil and Isildur and all those guys. In the middle, we don't necessarily have like the name drop factor, but
it is a really interesting period in Middle Earth history, and I'm kind of sad that we don't have more of it, but there is some really cool stuff there.
Luckily, wrote up 5 adventures time period. Each one was a snapshot in time of those different stages of the in-between thing. There was luckily a fair amount of source material I was able to derive from.
And I would love to see, yeah, good point, Hawk. And I would love to see more artwork and poetry that would be made on the Golden Age of Numenor. Yenny Dolphin, you guys have had on your podcast. I think
Friend of the show,
She loves the first stage, I think, most of all, but I'm not sure if she's done any artwork on the second age. That's worthwhile.
I'm not sure if she has. I'm sure she must have done some, and I feel bad now not knowing, but she has done a lot of great stuff on the first stage.
Alan Lee and John Howe, you just wondered, it'd be interesting to look at that as well when we come back next year.
And they're nice enough. We have their artwork in Other Minds Mag.
Oh, cool. And it will be interesting to see after the Amazon series comes out what's going to change, because even though that it sounds like that's going to be focused more on the later period in the fall, I think we'll see a fair bit of Numenor, and I think this is our opportunity to kind of get the rest of the world excited about it.
David Tatangi always interested friend, and then I did this whole saga on Numenor.
Numenorian friend.
For a while, so I had a whole thing, the Numenor project, that was just everything Numenor for about 5 years.
Is there anybody who hasn't heard maybe for a little while that you have a last comment or question?
I have one more question. I have a philosophical.
Okay.
So you're at Tolkien's program, where people is being fought against by the first. A lot of the times, especially later on when it's just elves are fighting, they don't really have this concept or knowledge of final victory. It's maybe ambiguous. And for the, in the older days of the elves, they had a relationship and understanding of like the Vala and of Eru. But for the people in like the Lord of the Rings times, they didn't really have that knowledge. So what do you think? Why did they continue to fight against evil when they felt like it was like pointless? Like what can we do? Like same speech that's not actually Tolkien's voice, but in the Two Towers, it was like there's some good in this world and it's worth fighting for. Like where did they find that? And also how can we apply it in our lives? Because we don't have that we don't understand how things are gonna end. We're also finite beings. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? I feel like it was like a very important part of his work. So have you?
I think it's a very important part of his work, and it's something we talk about a lot on the Prance and Pony podcast, because he talks about, I mean, you're right, not only is there no sense of final victory, there is a very clear sense of final defeat. Galadriel actually tells the Fellowship that Celeborn and I have been here fighting the long defeat. And you're thinking, well, that's dark, that's bleak, like, what, why are you doing this? But it comes from the fact that Tolkien was a medievalist, and so he's bringing in an idea from Beowulf and from Germanic literature that you're going to go out and you're going to fight the monsters, and you might win for a short time, but eventually you're going to lose. If you're Beowulf, you're going to beat Grendel today, but in a few decades, you're going to get killed by the dragon. And that's just the way it is. You're going to die someday. You're eventually going to lose. But Tolkien talked about the fact that, and he was actually really attracted to the idea that in Germanic literature, that never stops anybody from fighting. They still fight because they have to.
It's the circle of light in Beowulf, right?
It's the circle of light in Beowulf. We are fighting to defend the circle of light, which is civilization, humanity, and you can put, you can overlay a religious dimension to that if you want. You can talk about you're fighting for Christendom if you want, or not. It's all about humanity versus the monsters. And yeah, that's it. They're fighting because they have to, and because if they don't, nobody will. And I think the reason that characters in like the Third Age who don't know about the Valar and don't know about the history of you look at somebody like Merry and Pippin, right? Merry and Pippin don't know anything about the Silmarillion. They know nothing about Ulmo and Tuor. They don't know anything about Eärendil. They don't know these stories, and yet they are surrounded by enough people who do inspire them to fight, and they ultimately do fight. But I don't know. I mean, maybe at the end of the day, maybe they're ultimately fighting for their friends. Maybe they're fighting for something simpler. Maybe Merry and Pippin keep fighting even when defeat looks inevitable because there's somebody they love there. Let's look at Merry on the Pelennor Fields. I mean, when he's out there with Éowyn, and Éowyn, they're say facing off against the Witch King, but Éowyn's facing off, Merry's behind him. Merry fights because Éowyn is going to die, and he doesn't want her to die unaided. He doesn't expect to win. Nobody expects to be able to kill the Witch King, but Merry still does what he has to do because of Éowyn, his love for Éowyn, and the courage that gives him. And so he fights, and then she's ultimately able to kill the Witch King. So, yeah, I think Tolkien does a really good job of showing that yes, defeat is inevitable, and that's kind of a bummer, but we can still fight, and we should still fight, and the motivation to fight can either come from a loftier source, like faith in the Valar, faith in Eru, Eskel, the ultimate hope, or it can just come from your love of your friends. And he probably got some of that from his experience in World War I.
Really, the army, at a certain point when you stop fighting for your friend.
That's perfect. Yeah. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, thank you. I think just one more thing to add to that question is that it's recognizing the reality of the wounding of the world, Art of Mar.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that if you take one page out of the Lord of the Rings, in Fog on the Barrow Downs, we see two songs. One song is being sung by the Barrow-wight. And at the end of it, he says, "In the black wind, the stars shall die, and still in gold here let them lie, till the dark Lord lifts his hand over dead sea and withered land." That's the Barrow-wight song. But on the very next page, Tom Bombadil says, "Come never here again, leave your barrow empty, lost and forgotten be, darker than the darkness. Your gates stand forever shut, till the world is mended." And that's referring to Dagor-Dagara, very last battle.
Yeah.
So I know we don't have time to get into this right now, but I think part of it is that recognition of both. On the one hand, this world is a vale of tears, but on the other hand, there is a time when we'll win. But that is so far in the future that it's not going to change what happens to your family. So it is a long defeat, but I think ultimately that long defeat is changed. And according to his own little breadcrumbs, you have Turin Turambar with Gurthang actually killing Morgoth.
Yeah. And I think for Tolkien personally, I mean, as a Catholic, he definitely believed in a future where the world would be made whole. And I think what we see in Lord of the Rings is a really, really cool fusion of that kind of pagan Germanic sense of inevitable defeat with a Christian, but it doesn't have to be a Christian, sort of belief that there's something more and a hope that we can ultimately succeed, even though this world is doomed to defeat.
Well, it's been a joy to have you with us, Sean. Thank you for being part of our panel. Thank you, Chris, for being part of our conversation, Jeremiah, Katie, and then, of course, along with other people online, our in-house audience here.
Katie just says Dr. Flieger just wrote on this in her essay, "The Arch and the Keystone, the Friction of the Light and Dark." So thank you.
Verlin Flieger's work is amazing. Go check it out if you haven't already.
Thank you all so very much for attending this. Thank you so much, Sean. It was wonderful. Good to see you again, Chris. You'll be able to catch the recorded version of this. It'll be on the youtube.com/Tolkien Scholars, and of course, TolkienScholars.org website. And we're going to the stream for the gaming is continuing on the youtube.com/user/Tolkien Moot, or you can just go to tolkienmoot.org and click the links from there to watch the role-playing game session in this setting, to see how it unfolds, see what the characters do during this time period with these issues. And it is also a sneak peek of the One Ring role-playing game 2nd edition, right? The early Kickstarter, because I was Kickstarter supporter, so you got a little sneak peek of how that system works. Alpha. It's not even beta. So really early. We were one of the first ones to run the One Ring role-playing game at Tolkien Moot way back when the first One Ring role-playing game there were only like 75 people who had a copy for months, and we were lucky enough to be one of those people, and we streamed that live then. So it's a great way for people to get a sneak peek. So that's on the Tolkien Moot stream, and so people can watch that for the rest of the day. That'll be breaks and dinner and all that, but that's where it'll be. Thank you again so much.
Do I have time to do one more plug of the podcast?
Yes, please.
So people know where to find us. If you guys don't mind. Thank you. You guys are very gracious for my shameless plug. Prancing Pony Podcast. There's a new episode every Sunday. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, everywhere you listen to podcasts. There's just about 3 more episodes left in this season. Then we'll be taking a break. We'll be coming back in September 19th, just in time for Bilbo and Frodo's birthday, with Book 4, Frodo and Sam, Gollum, and there's a lot more coming. We've got the Amazon series coming out. We're planning to do some fun stuff for that, and we're starting to do moots now. Thank you, Katie, who's been listening to this. She's our community coordinator extraordinaire, has been helping us do moots now. So yeah, please just check us out, theprancingponypodcast.com, or all the social medias in the world.
Wherever you may be well, and Namaria.